Parents gave my sister $1,200 weekly while I paid for her education, and then I found out they had a hidden account. For as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around my family. I've always been the one to step in, to pick up the pieces, to ensure everyone else had what they needed. It's not something I regret, but looking back, I wonder how much of myself I've given away. Being the eldest in a family with limited means wasn't just a role, it was a responsibility that shaped my every decision. I put my personal happiness aside, took on extra shifts, skipped vacations, and saved every spare cent. When Linda and Frank, my parents, came to me pleading for help with Emily's college expenses, it wasn't a surprise. What else was I going to do but agree? They claimed they were on the brink of financial ruin. My father's health issues, they said, had drained their savings, and Emily, their golden child, deserved the chance to pursue her dreams. I was skeptical at first. I'd seen how Emily had been coddled, her whims indulged while I had scraped by on hand-me-downs and summer jobs. But when Linda's voice cracked as she spoke about how they couldn't bear to disappoint Emily, I relented. What choice did I have? Family was family, and Emily, despite everything, was still my sister. Supporting Emily meant sacrifices, big ones. I downgraded my apartment to a tiny studio barely large enough to swing open a closet door. My car, a modest but reliable sedan, was sold for a cheaper, clunkier model that stalled more often than it ran smoothly. Nights out with friends, the occasional treat of a new gadget, even my gym membership, all gone. My free time evaporated as I took on a second job, pouring every extra penny into Emily's tuition and living expenses. I convinced myself it was worth it. I imagined Emily working hard, using this opportunity to build a future for herself that she'd never otherwise have. At first, it seemed fine. Emily's thank you notes came sporadically, usually prompted by my parents, but I didn't mind. She'd send me quick updates about her classes, her professors, and her aspirations. But soon, I began noticing changes, things that didn't add up. Emily's social media was a gallery of designer clothes, weekend trips to high-end resorts, and pictures of expensive gadgets I knew she couldn't afford. When I asked her about it, she laughed and brushed it off, saying she had a generous boyfriend who liked to spoil her. She made it sound so casual, so normal, that I didn't push further. I told myself it wasn't my place to question her personal life. But the inconsistencies kept piling up. Emily never seemed stressed about her classes, her grades, or her finances. Meanwhile, I was barely scraping by, running myself into the ground to keep up with her growing expenses. My parents would occasionally drop hints about needing a little extra to cover unexpected costs, and I'd oblige, tightening my already suffocating budget. It felt endless, but I silenced the nagging voice in my head that questioned whether this was all worth it. After all, wasn't I doing the right thing? Sacrifice for family was a virtue, wasn't it? One evening, exhausted after a double shift, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some groceries. I hadn't planned to stay long, but the sound of laughter from the kitchen caught my attention. It wasn't unusual for Emily to visit them, but there was something about the tone of their voices that made me pause. I lingered in the hallway, groceries still in hand, listening to the conversation drifting out from the kitchen. Emily's voice was bright and carefree. She was laughing as she told them how amusing it was that they had managed to trick me into paying for her education while they secretly gave her $1,200 every week. My stomach tightened as her words sunk in. She joked about how gullible I was, mocking the sacrifices I'd made, while Linda and Frank chimed in with their own comments, laughing as though it were all a clever secret they had kept from me. They sounded so certain I'd never find out. The laughter continued, but I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My vision blurred with anger and betrayal as I slowly set the groceries down on the floor. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was certain, this wasn't going to end here. I didn't think twice. My hands trembled as I pushed open the kitchen door, and the laughter stopped mid-breath. 3 faces turned to me, their expressions shifting rapidly from surprise to unease. Emily's carefree grin faltered, and Linda's eyes darted nervously to Frank. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when someone knows they've been caught. My voice shook as I demanded answers, the words spilling out before I could even think. I asked them why, if they had enough money to give Emily $1,200 every week, they continued to demand that I pay for her education. Linda stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence, but her excuses were weak and riddled with hesitation. Frank, always the smoother talker, jumped in, claiming they had only done it for Emily's benefit. He insisted they wanted her to enjoy college life without the stress of financial worries. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The betrayal hit me harder with every word they spoke. Emily, standing there in her designer outfit, looked at me like I was overreacting. She rolled her eyes, muttering something about how I always made everything a bigger deal than it was. The lack of remorse in her voice was like a slap to the face. I reminded them of everything I had sacrificed, the car I sold, the endless nights eating instant noodles, the second job that drained every ounce of energy I had. I had put my life on hold to ensure Emily could have the education she deserved. And here they were, laughing about it, hiding the fact that they had been handing her $1,200 every week while I struggled to make ends meet. My voice cracked as I asked them how they could think this was acceptable. Linda tried to calm me down, saying they didn't mean to hurt me. She claimed they had kept it a secret to avoid making me feel unnecessary, to spare my pride. Frank chimed in, warning me not to make any rash decisions in the heat of the moment. He said family was about understanding and forgiveness, that I needed to think about the bigger picture. But their words only fueled my anger. The bigger picture? The bigger picture was that I had been used. They had taken advantage of my sense of duty, my loyalty to them, and turned it into a joke. And Emily, the golden child who could do no wrong, had played along without a second thought. She stood there, arms crossed, looking more annoyed than apologetic. I knew then that I couldn't keep doing this. For the first time in my life, I said no. I told them I was done financing Emily's education, done pouring my hard-earned money into a family that didn't respect me enough to be honest. Linda's face crumpled, and she pleaded with me to reconsider, saying Emily's future depended on my support. Frank's tone turned stern, warning me that I'd regret making a decision in anger. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolute. I told them I was freezing the shared account immediately and placing a hold on Emily's college payments. The words felt like a release, a weight lifting off my shoulders. For years, I had carried the burden of being the responsible one, the dependable one. Now, I was setting it down. The room erupted in protests. Linda's voice rose in desperation, while Frank's warnings grew sharper. Emily accused me of being selfish, saying I was ruining her life over a misunderstanding. But I didn't care. Their fury didn't intimidate me, it empowered me. For the first time, I was standing up for myself, and it felt like liberation. As I walked out of the kitchen, their voices followed me, a cacophony of anger and disbelief. But I didn't look back. I had made my choice, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right one. Returning home that night, my decision felt unwavering. I logged into my bank account and froze the shared funds I had set aside for Emily's education. I placed a hold on all upcoming payments to her college. It wasn't just a financial move, it was the first tangible act of reclaiming control over my life. For the first time in years, I went to bed without the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. The silence felt foreign but freeing. By morning, the calls began. Linda's voice was the first to crack through my phone's speaker. She didn't start with pleasantries, she launched directly into accusations. She claimed I was punishing Emily unfairly, sabotaging her future over a petty misunderstanding. I let her words wash over me without a response, and when she realized I wasn't biting, her tone shifted to guilt-laden appeals. She begged me to think of the sacrifices they had all made, how I was being cruel to my own sister. Not long after, Frank's number appeared on my screen. His message was more direct, less emotional. He accused me of abandoning my responsibilities, calling me selfish for prioritizing my pride over family unity. He warned me about burning bridges I couldn't rebuild and reminded me that family was all we had in the end. I felt a twinge of doubt creep in, but I pushed it aside. Their arguments didn't hold weight anymore, not after what I had overheard. Emily's call was the most bitter. Her words dripped with indignation as she accused me of ruining her life. She claimed I was destroying everything she'd worked for, that I was jealous of her opportunities. Her words cut deep, but the lack of accountability in her tone only strengthened my resolve. She hadn't learned anything, she was still the same entitled person they had coddled for years. I decided I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. I responded to their accusations with cold, hard facts. I reminded Linda and Frank of the years of sacrifices I had made while they hid the truth about the $1,200 they were giving Emily every week. I asked them how they justified taking my money under the guise of necessity when they clearly had enough to support her themselves. Their silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. They had no defense, only excuses. But the real turning point came later that day when I decided to dig deeper. My instincts told me there was more they weren't telling me. I accessed a few shared family accounts and scoured through years of records. That's when I found it, a hidden savings account under Frank's name. The balance was staggering. It wasn't just enough to cover Emily's tuition, it was enough to fund her extravagant lifestyle and then some. They had been hoarding money for years while letting me shoulder the financial burden, all under the pretense of family loyalty. The discovery made my blood boil, but it also brought clarity. I knew I couldn't let this go. I called for a family meeting, insisting that everyone be present. The tension was palpable as I laid out the evidence in front of them. Linda's face paled, and Frank's usual confident demeanor cracked. Emily sat silently, her eyes darting between us as I exposed the hidden account and their years of deceit. Frank tried to downplay it, saying the money was for emergencies, that they hadn't used it because they were saving it for the family's future. Linda chimed in, trying to turn the narrative, claiming they had always intended to tell me but didn't know how. Their justifications were weak, their excuses transparent. They had used me because it was convenient, and they never thought I'd find out. I told them I was done. This wasn't a family, it was a system of exploitation, and I was no longer going to be a part of it. Linda's tears didn't move me, nor did Frank's anger. I walked out of the house that day knowing it was the last time I'd let them take advantage of me. Weeks later, as I was beginning to rebuild my life, Emily's name lit up on my phone. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what she could possibly want. To my surprise, her tone wasn't confrontational but filled with hesitation. She admitted she had been thinking a lot and realized she had treated me unfairly. Emily said it was Linda and Frank who had suggested giving her the money while I paid for her education, convincing her it was the best way to keep things smooth. Then, her voice dropped, and she told me something that made my chest tighten. She had overheard fragments of a conversation between Linda and Frank about my name and credit. She wasn't entirely sure of their plans, but she caught enough to know they were plotting something, using words like credit and he won't find out. Emily urged me to check my credit history immediately. My stomach dropped as the full weight of what she was implying hit me. This wasn't over. The first thing I did immediately after Emily's call was check my credit history. My heart pounded as I logged in, scanning the entries for anything unusual. And there it was, a loan application filed under my name, one I had no knowledge of. The dates lined up perfectly with the timing Emily had mentioned in her call. Linda and Frank had gone through with their plan, hoping I'd never notice. My anger reignited, hotter and sharper than before. They had crossed a line that was no longer just about money, this was outright fraud. Armed with the evidence, I drove to their house. My hands shook as I held the printed report in one hand and my phone in the other, ready to record the confrontation if necessary. When I stepped through the door, Linda and Frank's faces immediately tensed. They knew why I was there before I even said a word. Without hesitation, I held up the report, demanding an explanation. Frank tried to take control of the conversation, his voice calm but defensive. He claimed it was a temporary measure, a desperate act to keep the family afloat. Linda chimed in, her tone pleading, saying they'd intended to pay it back once things got better. But their words felt hollow, excuses layered on top of lies. They weren't just asking for forgiveness, they were asking me to overlook a betrayal that went beyond anything I could have imagined. I laid out the impact of their actions, the years I had spent working myself to exhaustion, the sacrifices I made to support Emily, all while they had secretly hoarded money and now tried to steal my identity for their own gain. Their justifications crumbled under the weight of the truth, but Linda still reached for sympathy. She cried, begging me to see their perspective, to understand their desperation. But I was done understanding. I told them this was the last straw. They had exploited my trust for far too long, and this fraud was unforgivable. I declared that I was cutting ties permanently, effective immediately. Linda sobbed harder, clinging to me as I stepped back, but her tears didn't sway me. Frank stood silently, his face a mask of resignation, as I walked out the door for the final time. The next stop was the authorities. Filing a fraud report was both painful and cathartic. I had to recount every detail, provide all the evidence, and relive the betrayal step by step. But it was necessary. I couldn't let them continue to manipulate and harm me financially. The loan was denied, and a block was placed on my credit to prevent further abuse. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental in the context of everything I'd endured. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. The ties that had held me captive to their demands were severed. I began focusing on rebuilding my life, not just financially but emotionally. I started setting boundaries, rediscovering hobbies, and reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the years I spent prioritizing my family's needs. Slowly, I was piecing myself back together. Weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Emily's. Inside, the letter was heartfelt and raw. She admitted to dropping out of college, unable to continue after everything that had happened. She wrote about how much she'd grown since our last conversation, how she'd come to understand the gravity of her actions and the harm she'd caused. Emily apologized, not just for her part in the deceit but for allowing herself to be complicit in Linda and Frank's manipulations. The letter ended with a promise to make things right and a request to meet in person to talk. I set the letter down, staring at it for a long moment. Part of me felt relief, a flicker of hope that maybe some good could come from all this. But another part of me wasn't ready to trust again, not yet. For now, I kept the letter tucked away, unsure of what the next chapter would bring. After Emily's letter, I felt torn. A part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the chance to prove she had changed. But the scars of betrayal were still fresh, and trust wasn't something I could offer freely anymore. I decided to hold off on responding, choosing instead to observe from a distance. If Emily was sincere, her actions would speak louder than any apology. It didn't take long for Emily to reach out again, this time inviting me to meet her for coffee. I hesitated but ultimately agreed. When I arrived, she was already seated, looking different, more grounded, less self-assured in the way she used to be. Her posture and expression spoke volumes about the weight she carried now. Over the next hour, Emily shared what had been happening since I cut ties with the family. She explained how my actions had been a wake-up call, forcing her to confront not just her reliance on Linda and Frank but also her own complacency. She told me she had left college because she could no longer justify continuing when it was built on deceit. Instead, she had started freelancing, taking small jobs to support herself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. She admitted it was harder than she expected, but she was determined to make it work. Hearing this, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was serious about turning things around. Still, I kept my guard up. I told Emily I would be there to offer guidance, but there would be no financial support, no stepping in to fix her problems. She needed to stand on her own feet, and I wasn't going to be dragged back into the cycle of enabling. To my surprise, she didn't argue. Instead, she thanked me for meeting her and promised to keep me updated on her progress. Over the next few months, Emily's actions began to match her words. She found more consistent freelance work, started saving, and even re-enrolled in a community college, this time paying her own way. Her transformation wasn't instant, and there were setbacks, but she persevered. Each time we met, she seemed more confident, more independent. Slowly, I began to let my guard down, rebuilding a tentative trust that had once seemed impossible. But just as things seemed to be settling into a better place, a voicemail from Linda shattered the quiet progress. Her voice was strained, almost unrecognizable, as she begged me to return her call. She talked about regrets, about wanting to make things right, but the weight of her words felt hollow after everything that had happened. I listened to the message twice, trying to decide what to do. The person I had been months ago might have called back, might have given them another chance. But now, I wasn't so sure. I deleted the voicemail without responding, the knot in my stomach reminding me that some wounds take longer to heal than others. For now, I chose to focus on the progress Emily and I had made. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And that was more than I could have hoped for not so long ago. The months that followed were some of the most liberating of my life. For the first time, I wasn't weighed down by the relentless demands of my family. My focus shifted entirely to myself, my career, my goals, and my well-being. Professionally, I thrived, taking on new challenges that reignited my passion for work. Personally, I began exploring hobbies I had long abandoned, rediscovering what brought me joy. Without the constant financial drain and emotional manipulation, I felt like a new person, free to live life on my own terms. Emily continued to surprise me. She stayed true to her promise, working hard to rebuild her life without leaning on me for support. She found stability in her freelance work and balanced it with her classes at community college. Over time, her growth became evident not just in her actions but in her attitude. She approached life with a humility and determination I had never seen before. Slowly, I began to let her back into my world, though cautiously. Our relationship was no longer defined by guilt or obligation but by mutual respect. Rebuilding our sibling bond wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Emily and I found a new rhythm, one rooted in honesty and understanding. She never once asked for money or favors, and that alone spoke volumes about how much she had changed. For the first time in years, I saw her as an equal, someone who had faced her flaws and worked to overcome them. It wasn't a perfect process, but it felt real, and that mattered more than anything. Linda and Frank, on the other hand, remained a shadow in my life. Their messages came sporadically, filled with regret and thinly veiled attempts to pull me back in. They apologized for the past, claimed they had learned their lesson, and begged for reconciliation. But their words rang hollow. I couldn't forget the years of exploitation, the lies, and the ultimate betrayal of trying to take a loan in my name. Forgiving them might come someday, but forgetting, and trusting, never would. For my own well-being, I chose to maintain the distance, a decision that felt right no matter how much they tried to pull at my heartstrings. In their absence, my relationship with Emily grew stronger. It became something I valued deeply, not because it was built on family ties but because it was built on trust. Emily had earned her place back in my life, not through apologies but through action. She had proven she was no longer the entitled sibling I had once resented but someone who could stand on her own and face life with integrity. Looking back on everything, I realized how much I had grown, too. Standing up for myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. For years, I had believed that helping my family was a duty that outweighed my own needs. But I learned that true support doesn't come at the expense of one's self-worth. Boundaries aren't walls to keep others out, they're tools to protect what matters most. As I closed this chapter of my life, I felt at peace. The scars of betrayal hadn't faded completely, but they no longer defined me. My story wasn't just about cutting ties or rebuilding relationships, it was about rediscovering who I was outside the roles I had been forced to play. Family bonds are important, but they should be nurtured by trust and respect, not obligation and exploitation. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, and that freedom was something I would never take for granted again.